everyone. Welcome back to Gospel of Galactus. I know it's been a minute since I posted, and that's because my house flooded on Memorial Day. It happened at about 10:30 at night. I walked into my room for bed and I stepped in about 3 inches of water because the valve on my toilet just didn't close properly, and it just kept running and running and running and running. While homeowners insurance is fortunately taking care of things, that doesn't mean it's been any less hectic or hellacious around here. If it's not been the insurance adjusters, it's restoration specialists or tile people or someone coming out to measure the water layer between the tiles. And it's just completely messed up my schedule, making recording this second part really difficult. Fortunately, we're getting back on schedule, and that's why I'm here with the second part of my three-part series on why comics are the modern American mythology. So, last time around, we kind of covered the definitions of myth and comics while also establishing the ways in which comics and comic-like material have been in America since its foundation, and often was the language of the common people. If you haven't watched that, I highly recommend doing so, and to make it easier on you, I will be linking it at the end of this video. So for your benefit, though, I'm going to be super nice and recap those definitions now. Actually, I'm going to let my wife do it for me in post-production. I'm simply going to do this Doctor Strange motion as though I'm conjuring up the definition of myths right now. Mythology is a collection of works, especially belonging to a particular religious or cultural tradition. Or separately, a set of stories or beliefs about a particular person, institution, or situation, especially when exaggerated or fictitious, and that's from Oxford. Now, David Provalny, whom we'll discuss at length in just a moment, quotes noted anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski's definition of myth in his article, Comics as the Modern American Mythology for Ad Americum, Journal of Scientific American Studies, as a statement of primeval reality, which still lives in present-day life, and as a justification by precedent, supplies a retrospective pattern of moral values, sociological order, and magical belief. Myth is, therefore, an indispensable ingredient of all culture. It is, as we've seen, constantly regenerated. Every historical change creates its own mythology. See? Magic works when you outsource it to someone with more technical knowledge and skills than you. And I'm also going to magic up the definition for comic as well. That one should be appearing right about now. Generally speaking, a comic is a smaller, often 1 to 4 panel strip meant to break down a thought or an idea into a finely distilled point. The most effective comics could often get this done with just a single picture. We still see things like this today in things like New Yorker, Harper's Weekly. They even still exist on the comic front pages with stuff like Family Circus or even the great Ernie Bushmiller's Nancy. Which I knew the girl name is Olivia who's doing it now, but I can't remember her last name. But all of these serves as great examples of this model. Comic books, on the other hand, are often 22 pages detailing one or more story involving a titular hero going on some quest, usually against a villain, in search of truth, justice, and the American way. I wrapped up last week by promising to explore a couple of things in the next video, and that's exactly what we're going to do today. One of the things I promised to cover more extensively was how comics use the American dream myth as their moral foundation. The other thing I promised to cover was how comics were involved and talked about almost every event in society, and did so while using that moral foundation as its lens. And it's here once again that we come back to David Proliferat's article, Comics as the Modern American Mythology, which I mentioned in the first video, but will again link below for those who want to do some further reading. I said we'd talk more about him in my previous video, and in the immortal words of Ryan Macbeth, it's later. He's a Polish expert on American studies. He's published on a variety of topics, including Marvel, The Walking Dead, and a ton of other things. But it's his work on comics and American mythology that's of particular interest to me. He's posted this article 2 different times, and I'll link to them both, but I'm reasonably sure that one was the foundation for the other, because the second one was more of an academic article, with the first one being more geared towards pop culture. But there are significant differences. And it's in this column that he expertly lays out not only how comics are uniquely American, but how they take American events, conversations, and conventions and use them throughout their message. In other words, there will be no doubt the books that you're reading have an American bent to them, and often features writers espousing American values and really not doing it quietly. I mean, the very first image of Captain America #1, the cover featured the titular hero delivering 5 knuckles of freedom to Adolf Hitler. And it did so on March 1st in 1941. This was 10 months before Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and drew the United States into the war. So this kind of brings me to a related tangent and pet peeve. When people say comics are for kids and writers should keep politics out of comics, it's almost an automatic tell that that person has either never read a comic or completely misunderstood what they were reading, if they think that comics and politics don't mix. Hell, Stan Lee used to post his political and social thoughts in every issue of Marvel Comics. It was called Stan's Soapbox. So comics have always been political, as the last 2 images alone have shown. But now we gotta back this up with some academic evidence, right? That's what we're here to do. We'll come back to Proliferate in just a second, but our first quote comes from Dr. Christopher Wood. He's an archaeologist and art historian at Baylor University in Waco, Texas. It's from his wonderful book called Heroes Masked and Mythic: Echoes of Ancient Archetypes in Comic Book Characters. And the quote is, "The term myth, as we commonly think of it today, was borrowed by English speakers in the early 19th century to refer to a story or a series of etiological stories involving supernatural forces or beings that reinforced a religious ritual or belief. In essence, Homer's heroes were the ancient equivalent of the modern comic book hero. One might say that the comic book hero has its roots deep in the oral tradition of the ancient world. Comic book superheroes, like the successive stories of the ancient Greek heroes, have evolved to match the trends and values of their society." End quote. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about an ancient comic like the Tabula Iliaca Capitolina, the first issue of Captain America, something a little bit later like an X-Men graphic novel, God Loves, Man Kills, or even the modern hit by Tom King, Vision. Comics have and will always be politically and socially intertwined. In fact, even the heroes that we read now have these notions and ideas baked into their core. Just take someone like Batman, who is wealthier than any man needs to be, but still seeks justice for the common man. Quoted in Proliferat's article, Polish film critic Zygmunt Kaluzinski said it best when he said the following about Batman's ethos. On the one hand, the great topic of the American culture, violence. On the other hand, the obsessive cult of justice. That is why Batman is a myth. It corresponds to the needs of the country. We have thousands of comics, but this one is unique because it underlines the problems of a civilization which slowly becomes worldwide. Polish film journalist Janusz Wroblewski said very succinctly that Batman underlines the American myth about omnipotence granted by money. And then finally, Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Zizek strongly believes that comics reflect the social moods much better than classic or high culture works, and they contain hidden ideological and political content. Now, I tend to agree with all of their sentiments. While most people are not going to have the ability to experience high art in the modern era, especially with the get-in pricing for some of these things, it's easy to understand why something as cheap as a comic book would bring in a larger audience at $3.99, which is the current price of a comic book, versus $100 for a single ticket to Hadestown, which is the current top play on Broadway. So we understand why comics were used to carry important messages, but how were those messages placed in comics? Well, it greatly depended on the era. As we lightly touched on in the last video, the reason comics became the way to incorporate important messages is that nearly everyone had grown up reading the press comics. This is where the integration of the immigrant took place. At the very minimum, they knew their comics because those were simple, easy lessons on American culture for them to learn and absorb. Plus, the rising popularity of comics led to them getting their own books in the late 1920s. So the first Marvel comic was published under the banner Timely in 1939, and it featured the Human Torch, the android version, not the high-flying member of the Fantastic Four. It also featured the Jungle King Kazar, and it featured the debut of one Namor the Submariner. Some of the first actions these superheroes undertake included ridding the world of Nazi soldiers and defending America from the growing threat of communism after the fall of the Third Reich. These early editions of heroes exist before the boom of heroes, so we're kind of talking about 1929 to 1961 here. Definitely before the era of the Vietnam War. Kowalny called this area the period of superheroes and their extraordinary problems. So the protagonists in those stories are persons with extraordinary skills and superhuman powers. Similar to the heroes from the ancient myths, they fight against injustice and evil and represent all the American virtues. Those heroes become the embodiment of the uniqueness of the American nation. End quote. So after this, you get an explosion of content related to two topics that dominated the American zeitgeist at the time, which were the space race and nuclear energy. This period lasts from 1961 to 1980. This is probably the period of superheroes that really put them in the conversation of unique American creations. Kowalny calls this period the period of superheroes and their ordinary problems. We get the creation of heroes with radioactive powers or powers related to radiation. We also get heroes with powers tied to space and the space race. Sometimes, like in the case of the Fantastic Four, we get heroes with powers tied to both at the same time. Spider-Man emerges from this area as the most popular hero Marvel has ever made, which is a title he still holds today. We also get the radioactive Hulk and even the cosmic Miss Marvel, who takes over after the death of Captain Marvel, which was a graphic novel in its own right. It's a smorgasbord of heroes created by radiation and dwelling in space. It's right after this that we get our first inclusion of gods and myths from the other cultures. It happens in August of 1962 with Journey into Mystery, which is when we get our first appearance of Thor. Well, very much a Norse god through and through. See, Thor would see much of his lore reshaped and reworked to fit in with the Marvel pantheon. Before I read the following quote, I really need to preface it by saying that Stan Lee has a frankly underreported history of ginning up his own contributions to Marvel's pantheons. Hell, a story broke yesterday that's very relevant to what we're talking about here. Very. Neil Kirby, the son of Marvel legend Jack Kirby, felt almost obligated to defend the work of his father when this documentary about Stan Lee crops up on Disney Plus on June the 16th. While I'm not going to read the whole statement, I'm going to highlight a couple of points that are very relevant to what we're discussing here today. If you want a fair and honest look at Stan Lee's life, I highly recommend checking out Josie Reisman's book on Stan Lee, True Believer, Rise and Fall of Stan Lee. Not only does she do a fantastic job of laying out what I would consider the most unbiased and fair look at Stan Lee's relationship with the truth and how ultimately he told these stories so many times that he probably just began to believe them. Just read her book. I'm especially highlighting it because it's Trans Month and she's a tremendously gifted trans writer. And on this channel, we stand a good author, especially one who knows her shit. But getting back to Neil, here's the highlight of what he had to say about mythology and their usage in Marvel. Quote, "It's not any big secret that there has always been controversy over the parts that were played in the creation and success of Marvel's character. Stan Lee had the fortunate circumstance to have access to the corporate megaphone and media, and he used these to create his own mythos as to the creation of the Marvel character pantheon. It should be noted, and is generally accepted, that Stan Lee had a very limited knowledge of history, mythology, and science. On the other hand, my father's knowledge of these subjects, to which I and many others can personally attest, was extensive." Okay, sure. This may sound like sour grapes, though I need to stress here that I condensed a few sections and definitely didn't read the whole thing because it was less relevant to our purposes and more relevant to the issue of creators' rights. The point here is that even Neil Kirby is highlighting, and I absolutely agree with him, that mythology, science, and history are literally at the core of these characters, and it was his father's immensely deep knowledge of these subjects that made the comics as rich as they were, and that was at the heart of this era's push. It's after this that we get heroes like Iron Man, whose origin story is literally an opinion on the Vietnam War and Stan Lee's stated intent to make hippies like a billionaire from the military-industrial complex. We also get characters rich in African mythology mixed with African American politics in Black Panther. Kirby and Lee would also create the X-Men, who were stand-ins for Jews and African Americans seeking basic citizenship and rights. Doctor Strange would be influenced by Buddhism, the Kabbalah, Hinduism, occultism, and Satanism. And then it all comes crashing to a halt in the 1950s. Enter Frederick Wortham and his pseudoscientific seduction of the innocent. This bag of smashed assholes in print put forth the fact that any child reading comic books would be prone to a life of juvenile delinquency and crime. Unfortunately, this book had such an impact on society that it led to the creation of a new oversight board and the destruction of comics as people knew them. For the immediate future, anyhow. So, Wortham was a German-born American doctor who abused basic logic and experimental design to support a conclusion he already believed in. It was crackpot science at its worst and its most effective, at least in terms of achieving its goals and of convincing people that two completely unrelated things were, in fact, causal. But nothing like that would ever happen again, right? So the Comic Code Authority would be the abomination to come from this scientific heresy. It was created in 1954, and soon after the creation of the CCA, it pretty much became impossible to feature any kind of anything. I mean, you couldn't glorify crime, you couldn't show scary images, you couldn't show demons or vampires or werewolves. In fact, here's an entire list of things, items you couldn't run in comics, as this would probably be easier than attempting to list them individually. You can pause the video and read through them. It made writing anything interesting really problematic, and it lasted a lot longer than it should have. It took the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, plus Marvel editor Stan Lee, for the first major blow to be delivered to the CCA in 1971. So the Department of Education and blah, blah, blah had come to Marvel in an attempt to reach younger kids and alert them about the dangers of drugs, which at that time had been running rampant. Lee did better than one book. He did 3. The Amazing Spider-Man number 96 through 98 were sent off for approval, and the CCA denied them due to content. It's like one hand didn't get the message from the other. So, figuring he had the full support of the US government, Lee said to hell with them and published it without their stamp on it. This was the first time a major publisher had dared to publish a comic without this stamp. The stamp was there to ensure parents that it had passed this strict set of standards and was put there with the specific intent of making the content child approved. But if the CCA is banning content commissioned by the government, were they really doing their job, or were they just kind of acting as a censorship board at this point? So DC would criticize Marvel for doing this, and then they'd do the exact same thing only a few months later. That's a trend that still continues to this day. So DC's story on the dangers of heroin would occur in Green Lantern Green Arrow and featured Roy Speedy Harper absolutely blasted out of his mind on heroin. If we're being honest, I have to imagine a lot of superheroes would probably suffer from this addiction if they existed. I mean, look at the number of musicians and actors who suffered from this addiction. I've suffered from this addiction. You know, people tasked with seeing the absolute worst humanity has to offer, stuff that even the military couldn't handle, but like on a regular, intense basis, you might just be doing it for other countries too. No thanks. So, other events like the night Gwen Stacy died and Swamp Thing actually being denied a stamp of approval would also see people stop caring, and eventually the CCA's power waned to the point that it became a formality until like 2001 when Marvel just stopped submitting to them. They'd last for another decade beyond that in some capacity or another until they finally died alone and unloved. That's right. This BS organization that was based on a lie and pseudoscience lasted from 1954 to 2011. And this is coming out of the previously goody-goody era that we get to the gritty era of comics. And this era runs from 1980 to 2001 and is fittingly referenced as the period of triumph, death, and life after death. I say fittingly because this is where we begin to see a huge merging of truly mature ideas and concepts into comics. And this is ushered in by Mouse, written by Art Spiegelman. So, not only does Mouse redefine how comics are viewed by writers, reviewers, and even the public at large, it becomes the first comic to ever win a Pulitzer Prize. Simply phenomenal work. We also see writers like Neil Gaiman creating Sandman and Hellblazer, showcasing that comics are the perfect venue for discussing theological ideas and structures. We actually see the entire Judeo-Christian pantheon, except that it's continuity within a major comic publisher in DC/Vertigo. Hell, even Lucifer got his own show on Fox, like decades down the line, like almost like 40 years. So that's how time-honored and treasured Gaiman's contributions to comic and comic mythology were. Once you hit the 80s and 90s, you get some of the best writing that we've ever seen in comics. These books are still held up and venerated as classics to this very day, and that's because these people had a full run to discuss a wide range of issues without some major corporation shutting down the idea because it's too much. Politics and religion were quite literally the soup du jour, the topics of the day, if you will, and they still define some of the greatest writing within Marvel, DC, and Vertigo. Even when you get to the 2000s, comics played a major role in shaping the attitudes and perceptions on American cultures and values. Immediately after 9/11, Marvel issued every single one of their comics with a completely black cover. The story inside, they were about the true heroes of 9/11 and downplayed superheroes in a way that I can't honestly think of another time where it happened like that. I mean, if you were to think of it in wrestling terms, I remember Marvel breaking kayfabe for the first time ever, like with a real life event. With Marvel being based in New York, everyone there was deeply impacted by the destruction of the Twin Towers. So, I think this is a perfect place to wrap up and mention that the third and final video on the introduction to this topic will focus on mythic reinvention and how norms and values in American society would continue to be defined and redefined, most importantly, through characters and the reinventions of those characters. This was always kind of meant to be the most meaty section of the story, and I hope I've done a good job of breaking this down and kind of showing you America's politics within comics through the different eras. I'm going to have links to everything mentioned here in the description below. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe to this channel. If you can, leave a comment with what you liked, what you didn't like, what you would change. Your support honestly means everything to me, and I want to give you guys what you want. So not listening to viewers about what they want from me would be a rather silly move on my part. So let me thank you one last time and remind you that we will have part 3 of this series up shortly. I'm still dealing with the effects of my house being flooded on Memorial Day. They said I wouldn't have my bedroom back for 2 months. 2 months! 2 months! Post a picture of the bedroom. For post-production life, post a picture of the bedroom to show them this. But yeah, I'm taking a little bit longer than usual, but I'm aiming to be consistent with content. And I'm also planning on releasing a series of interviews with many noted academics and YouTubers in the field of mythology, historical, religious studies, and atheism here on Gospel of Galactus. I hope you'll stick around and support the channel, but until next time, this has been Why Comics Are the Modern American Mythology Part 2 on Gospel of Galactus. I'm Kane Webb, and I'm reminding you, stay hungry for knowledge, guys.